So do we have what it takes? I would say that the Camden Conference participants, you have shown that we have what it takes because you're here and because I think we've had an extraordinary weekend of conversation. We have our panelists back, those who have survived to the last round. What I'd like to suggest to the panelists is that we have lightning round for the next hour and 5 minutes. So when questions are asked, not everybody has to answer every question. And if it's not directed to an individual, I'll just ask someone to lead and 60-second answers from each of the panelists. That'll maximize the participation of all of you. I know some of you feel you've had your hand up and I haven't seen you. I apologize if that's the case, but there are ushers and they have these yellow signs, 1, 2, over here, and 3. Please direct your attention to the ushers if you'd like to ask a question, and I will try to get all of them in during the next hour and 5 minutes. Who would like to lead?
Hamilton, Reserve, Southport. Americans like to get things done. And what is the process by which all these tremendous ideas could be melded together into a coherent policy, end up on the president's desk, and turn out at a Harvard commencement Marshall Plan type speech that we had in 1948 and really get things going?
Well, that's a really great question. One thing the Camden Conference will do is, as I said before this morning, is put all of this on its website so it's available. A second issue to think about, we were just talking about it. How would we broadcast some of the ideas and proposals from this conference out beyond Camden, Maine, out to the wider world? And how can this conference be replicated across the country because we need greater citizen engagement? But Captain Porter, you've got some thoughts on this.
I actually, it's not me. I'll defer to you all again, because this morning someone came up to me and suggested that maybe we could get, the service clubs, the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club. They're always looking for things like this. It's a national organization. Maybe they should be alerted. Maybe they should. Maybe somebody should write to them and talk about that. Someone else asked me, why aren't the politicians discussing this in the upcoming elections? Why aren't these concepts being addressed across the board in all of the platforms? Not in a partisan manner, but just as we finally recognized containment as a strategy that we could fall in behind in a bipartisan way, in a unified way, and that resulted in the Solarium project that was led by General Eisenhower. I think that's where we are. If I think of enough people fall in behind the essence of a strategy that's based on sustainability, hope, and opportunity instead of fear and threat, that's the way to get it going, and it needs to start at the grassroots.
And I guess I'd say one way to get it to President Obama is to speak up publicly. I mean, one of the things that the Occupy movement did succeed in doing was to illuminate the issue of income inequality in a way that people could understand it. And I thought that was a great contribution, and it has forced the Republican candidates in all those debates to talk about that issue. So that's one additional. And
then the last thing I would say is, we just heard it in the last presentation. Don't be passive. There's a lot more to playing a part than just hitting like, as the comment was made, and we've seen the power of it. So you are it. We are the ones that we're looking for to help us get the word out and open a dialogue.
Question over here. Yes.
Thank you. Courtney Haight from Blue Hill. This is, I think, directed maybe to Deborah and maybe Captain Porter. U.S. military is withdrawn from Iraq. It appears that the Sunni-Shiite divide remains unresolved. What's the outlook there with those folks trying to deal with their own problems in that kind of situation? Looks kind of tough to me.
And I think that for the Iraqis, certainly the Syrian revolt has exacerbated that Sunni-Shia tension more than I would have guessed, because what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is reports of two sets of weapon trails going to Syria. Muqtada Sadr's people are there to help President Bashar al-Assad, and the Sunnis of Anbar province are there to help the Sunnis of Homs. That can't be good. The Iraqi vote at the Arab League was pro-Bashar. They said that they wouldn't honor any of the sanctions against Syria, which made them completely ineffective and ended that way that the Arab League had of pressuring Syria. But I think until Syria is resolved, that tension will continue in Iraq.
There's going to be a Friends of Syria conference, and Hillary Clinton's going to attend it. It's being engineered by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab League. There are a couple of proposals to try to alleviate the suffering of the civilians. One would be to create humanitarian zones to which civilians could flee and be protected, probably by Turkey and others inside of Syria. A second proposal countries have been thinking about is should the international community now arm the Syrian rebel army? And that speaks directly to Deborah's point. There was a car bomb attack in Aleppo last weekend, and the suspicion is it was an al-Qaeda affiliate. And so if you begin to arm the Syrian rebel forces, you may be arming some al-Qaeda affiliate forces. It's a very dangerous proposition and a very difficult question for the Obama administration and others. Yes.
Hi, Caitlin Tierney from Minnesota. I'm graduating.
Go Vikes.
Yes, sir. I'm graduating from high school this June, and we talked a lot about this weekend our relationship with China. And one thing I've noticed while applying for college this year is that my competition is not just within the United States, that my competition is internationally, and going forward into college, I'm competing against everyone in this world for my job. And so I was wondering what advice you have for my generation when we're sitting in your seats years from now, if we have what it takes. What can we do to ensure that we have what it takes to run this country and stay a superpower?
Great question. Maybe the two colonels, Colonel Wilkerson and Colonel Mickleby, might answer that.
Well, let me address it from the perspective of the oldest public university in the United States, the College of William and Mary. We have a tremendous job surviving. The state of Virginia has increasingly cut off the public aspect of the university. We're down to less than 15% now. The only way we can regain that money is by tuition, essentially. We don't have a very large endowment. So we like foreign students, not just because of the diversity they bring and the sort of globalization aspect it brings to our educational process, but because they're full payers. They pay full tuition, no financial assistance. It's created a great animosity within the state of Virginia because UVA and William and Mary are the bastions of the university system, and you have people in Fairfax County, for example, who blow the SATs away, who can't get in their own state's colleges because foreign students are taking the seats. What I say when I talk politically about this is, one, you need to raise the money you're paying for public education in the state of Virginia. Maryland, for example, is about 44%. Virginia's about 12% across the state. That's terrible. And secondly, you need to understand what we think we're doing. It's not all commercial. It's not all survival. We are actually educating the global community. And in the process, we're educating our own people. There's got to be a balance in there somewhere. But I would answer your question directly by saying that I think educating the Chinese and educating the Americans simultaneously and in an environment where they will not forget each other when they go out into the wider world is a positive thing for you and for them.
I'd just like to address just a key word, competition, competitor. Let's just look at the word competitor. The root stem of the word competitor is competare. Competare is Latin. When you translate that out of Latin, it means to strive together. It doesn't mean trip the guy next to you, kick him in the head, and then skip your way to the finish line. So this is an issue of self-reflection, of looking inside. Be willing to compete. Have the confidence that we have a values-based system, and our values are strong, that we have the right model going forward in the world. And stay curious. Another guy that I really love to quote, John Barrymore, Drew's grandpa, old actor. He said, "You're only old when regrets take the place of dreams." You gotta stay curious. You gotta constantly just be wondering about things because there is no status quo. You're never there, trust me. I always say when I went to Top Gun, you know, I was like, you know, first of all, there's no trophy, you don't get to play volleyball, so I don't know what the hell. But you know, you think once you get to Top Gun, then you're right there. Well, there's always somebody out there that's better than you. There's always somebody out there. There's always some bad mamma jamma out there. So just, that's nothing to be afraid of. It's something to pursue. So just constantly stay curious. Don't be afraid of competition, and recognize, just as Larry said, in the process of competing with your Chinese compatriots, you're going to make each other stronger, and you're going to make each other better, and we, in the aggregate, will be better for it. So I don't have no question about, I mean, I'm putting my future in your hands, you know, so there you have it.
Colonel, could you repeat that John Barrymore quote? Really?
What's that?
The John Barrymore quote. You said it quickly. What
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, you're only old when regrets take the place of dreams.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Governor DuPont.
I don't hear anybody thinking that one through very well. I'm not sure where that stands. But I would just say to the questioner, I don't think you have a big problem. You're an American. You're here. You speak well. You've just graduated. I think you're going to get a job with no problem. But you just got to go and try to get it and talk to the people who'd like to hire you and make yourself sound like that's what they want to hear.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our remote locations. This is from Stephanie Cook from Kensington, Maryland, from Camden. Okay? It must be one of the written questions. Are nuclear weapons part of the old world way of thinking? Do we have confidence as a nation to go to zero? President Obama gave a speech in Prague about 2 years ago saying our ultimate ambition must be to destroy all nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Sam Nunn are part of a group of wise men saying we must get rid of nuclear weapons. We have a lot of members of this panel who can speak to that. Who would like to go first? Larry.
General Colin Powell, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a number of us had some really soul-searching discussions about this. 2 points came up that I think are going to be points throughout this discussion. And incidentally, as I left Washington, the rumor was being circulated, I'm sure leaked by the White House, that we're going to 300.
Can you explain?
We went from about 28,000 down to about 2,200, down to about 1,500, and now we're talking about going to 300.
Nuclear warheads.
Nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
That's pretty dramatic. The Moscow Treaty, which is a 3-page treaty that Secretary Powell literally negotiated by himself because the administration wasn't interested in it, brought us down from about 28 to 2,200 over a period of years. But here's the other point, and Powell made this point as a soldier and a citizen, and it was a powerful point. The genie's out of the bottle. You cannot disinvent, and that caused a battle with William Safire in the New York Times. He said disinvent wasn't a word. We sent him a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, which showed Prime Minister Disraeli using it, I think, in 1859. But you can't disinvent nuclear weapons. And so as long as there's the potential for someone to have them in the world, we probably aren't ever going to make the decision to go to zero. Now, if you could come up with some regime, some international regime that would give everyone confidence that you could prevent this, then it might be different. And I think nuclear weapon-free zones, in particular, are a possibility. They'd start regionally, and then they'd expand, and maybe at some point we might be able to totally go to zero.
And I thought it was an interestingly worded question, the we. Who is the we, as Larry was saying? Because here's the we who have nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom, France, the United States, Russia, China, Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea. They all have nuclear weapons. And Iran is seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. A lot of people think if Iran gets them, Saudi Arabia and Egypt will try to have a nuclear weapons capacity. So maybe the answer here, to think idealistically, gets back to President Kennedy's speech when he announced the Limited Test Ban Treaty, June 1963. The first time we said we would limit our testing of nuclear weapons, we wouldn't test in the atmosphere. And he said in that speech, we have to begin to think not just as Americans versus Russians, We have to think of the human interest. This gets to the global consciousness we have to fight climate change together and to fight the scourge of nuclear weapons together. So the we is important. I agree with Larry. As long as the North Koreans and the Chinese and Russians have nuclear weapons, it's very unlikely, in fact, it wouldn't be very smart of us to give up nuclear weapons. Can we develop in the next 50 to 100 years a global consciousness among the nuclear weapons powers to do the right thing and begin to draw these weapons down at a far faster rate? I think that's the great challenge that we see. We have a question up here. Yes.
Yes, Jim Stiles, Tampa, Florida. The one speaker this weekend said that we have given billions of dollars to Hosni Mubarak and the Egyptian military. Another speaker said we don't trust the Egyptian military. The last speaker said Egypt could be a very pivotal country in the near future. What should our strategy be?
Towards Egypt.
Towards Egypt?
Deborah, you want to start there?
Yeah, we'll have to split this one. I think that it's becoming a tough question in the State Department about what our strategy should be. And, you know, as a journalist, it's probably best that I just report out what experts have said. And I think the best approach is we need to be very clear about what our values are.
Exactly.
And there will be red lines for us. You can go this far and no further. Otherwise, we actually will start to think about taking that money away. What we're seeing for the first time ever within the Egyptian political arena is a new game with new rules. Last week, the Muslim Brotherhood said, so if you take $1.3 billion away, we'll think about reassessing the treaty with Israel. That's the first time that that's happened. So that's a tool that they're testing. I think we need to say, bad tool, don't go there. That's already been done. And so I think it's a matter of figuring out what the language of the dance is going to be to guide us over this next year, because there's some very important things that are happening this year in Egypt. We will see if we're going to get to civilian leadership. We're going to see if we're going to get to transparency in the military. And those are big issues, and we are going to be a player in those.
I'll take just a very quick
Please, Captain.
And I'm not getting out of my lane here, I don't think, even though the views expressed are mine only. They don't reflect the official position of the United States government or the Department of Defense. I have a problem when people ask me, what is our strategy for a particular place? That can be a campaign plan, that can be some kind of an operation or a plan, but it's not a strategy. A strategy, I think, is much larger than that. And whenever we think in terms of any strategy, it is very multifaceted. This has to do with our economic relationship. It has to do with our public, diplomatic, military, interpersonal relationships. As long as we ground ourselves, and this is really why Puck and I wanted to write the narrative, it wasn't to provide a strategy, it was to provide a strategic context upon which we could base our decisions in the future without having to reinvent a strategy every time there was a crisis in any given place. So I think if we remain true to the underlying values that characterize us as Americans and focused on those values, that will very easily help us shape our policy as these crises arise.
Can I add?
Jim, I would say to your question, our strategy, the Obama administration's strategy, is to maintain U.S. influence with the keystone state in the Middle East, as Deborah said, the most important state. And I think look for two things, two factors they'll be looking at very closely. As Deborah said, the Camp David Accords, Jimmy Carter's March 1979 treaty between Egypt and Israel, that's the bedrock of security in the Middle East. If the Egyptian government moves away from it, that's going to imperil U.S. aid. The Congress, I think, will cut it. The second is the possible trial of 19 American NGO workers for democracy promotion. If they actually are put on trial, some of them, I would think in either of those cases, Congress, Republicans and Democrats, will move to cut aid. Last point. David Ignatius, very influential columnist in the Washington Post, warned 2 weeks ago, we're in a roller coaster ride looking at Egypt over the next couple of years. If we begin to react to every dip and we begin to take away our marbles, we're going to be left with very little influence. He counseled patience, as did I in a column I wrote for the Boston Globe on Friday. we have to be very careful not to leave the playing field because we don't like what's happening. As Deborah said, this may go on for several years. And Egypt is too important for us to just go home and say we don't like what they're doing and therefore we're not going to engage.
I'd like to just add one other thing. We need to be very careful and watchful about our approach, I won't call it a strategy, towards Egypt, and make sure it doesn't come via the present leadership in Tel Aviv.
Can I add something to that?
Governor, please.
You know, if we had a list in front of us of all the gifts that America makes to countries around the world, that would be a very long list.
Yeah.
And they're all being given for some reason. Sometimes it's a reason because we don't want a war to start. That's the Middle East, if you look at Israel and the other countries there. The other countries we're giving weapons to, we're giving airplanes to, and I don't think you can just say we're going to get rid of this one and this one. If you're going to get rid of a lot of them, it's got to be put together with some thought. So we make sure we know what we're doing, because having most of those contributions is somehow helping us, even though it's expensive.
It's a very good point. There's a lot of self-interest riding on this aid,
There are.
as Governor DuPont pointed out. Yes, here.
Good morning, it's Charlie Peters from Fort Meade, Maryland. First off, thank you all for your service and your leadership on these issues. My question's regarding the narrative. Colonel Muckaby, I heard you say last night that you believed this change would happen in private industry and not government, and I was hoping you could maybe expand on that a little bit today.
Sure. But I mean, there's no magic formula to this. It's just that government's broken right now. We're not getting anywhere, but we're running out of time. Private sector, I firmly believe, is going to be the change agent for the country. And get a lot of pushback for that, because we're in the financial crisis that we're in because the private sector couldn't be trusted. Well, get over it. The private sector, there's plenty of solid citizens out there that are going to try to do the right thing, and and there's no amount of regulation that's going to be able to control every behavior. Just by the same token, that if you don't want to have any regulation, okay, what are you going to give up and what are you going to contribute? I mean, those are the fundamental questions. In the private sector, it's going to have to happen. That is our tradition as Americans, as was already pointed out. So this urban legend of government being involved in too much in the private sector, that is going to be our solution set. That's part of what, when you get into the practical aspects of what we think about the narrative of the National Prosperity and Security Act, is how are we going to converge our public, private, and civil sector resources so we can have private profit for public good. That's an individual decision as a part of citizens being in the private sector. There is no disconnecting what we do in the private sector from the greater societal good. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, and so again, the idea that, hey, I'm just, it's just business, or that, I've got my work life and I've got my home life. That's not the world we live in. You can't disassociate your moral requirements in your private or business life away from your public moral obligation as being part of this republic. That's the point I was driving at. And I think right now, the only institutions that have the agility, adaptability, and the incentive, i.e., looking for a profit, which is okay. God, it's America. Looking for a profit is going to be the private sector. We just don't have the agility in government right now to skip beyond our ideological fistfights. That's what I meant by that.
I would just add to that some of our most dynamic partners at New America are in the private sector. And I'd also say that a lot of them are angry with the monopolistic tendencies of certain elements of the private sector. They see them as hurtful to them. So, I mean, they're not unaware that we do have some huge problems in that regard. But by and large, I agree with everything that Mark just said, that the private sector's got the dynamics, it's got the enlightened self-interest, it's got the mechanisms, the agility. We got to have them.
I'm a bit of a contrarian on this issue. I certainly recognize the strengths in the private sector. I don't think we should conclude that all government is ineffective. Certainly, in my experience in the federal government, in the EPA, in the Department of Defense, and the State Department, we have great people and smoothly functioning federal agencies doing really important and good work for our people. I would point the finger more at Congress and elected politicians, but I don't think we should paint with too broad a brush. That's just my own view.
I'm sorry, and I agree with that. I should have probably cleared that up. In conjunction with the private sector, I think the most interesting political actors in the nation right now that are going to have the most impact are mayors, because they actually have to look their constituents in the eye, walk down the street and go, hey, Bob, what are you doing for me today? Well, geez, not much for you, but Fred's getting a good deal because, he's got a better idea than you. So I mean, to me, that's where the change is going to happen.
And I would add governors.
And go.
Yeah.
Governor DuPont, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say that in terms of the mayors, the smaller the city, the tougher it is for a mayor.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's one thing to be mayor of New York and maybe mayor of this town, but if you come to a little town in southern Delaware and you're the mayor, that's an awful job. Everybody talks to you. Everybody knows you. Everybody's got an idea that if we just had another $150,000 here, everything would be better. And you got to deal with that every day. So you shouldn't run for mayor. Just my advice.
I'm all about talking. I'm not about accountability. So there you have it.
That's good.
Governor DuPont, can I ask you, do you subscribe to the view that we should be looking for, in essence, people who've had executive authority to lead the country, governors, mayors, as opposed to just members of the Senate or House?
I'm not sure the point you're making.
There's a theory, well, sometimes people, Governor Romney makes this point, for instance, if you've had executive authority, you may have better experience to run the country, i.e. as president, than if you've just been merely a member of the Senate or House. Do you agree to that?
I think I think there's some accuracy in that. If you have run something in business or for the military, and if you've run it and for some years you've had to make it all work and get it all put together, I think you would do much better than somebody who served a few years just in the House of Representatives and hasn't had that experience. So I would say that looking outside is probably a place you'll find better thinking, though there are some senators and congressmen who are very good at their thinking.
Yeah.
But I think you'd be better off with somebody who's been in the real world.
Thank you. Yes.
Eric Schwartz, Washington, D.C. We had a wonderful discussion this morning about education, and we've been talking the last couple of days about public affairs. I wonder about the level of education that the populace as a whole has about public affairs when we have the Kardashians as our role models and people are more aware about Dancing with the Stars in the Middle East. Do you think our current media system adequately serves the population here in the United States?
Deborah. It's all yours, Deborah.
Can I have the next 10 hours? No, obviously I don't. And it's been a process in the same way that, we saw schools organized on an old model of agriculture. Our media is organized on an old model of commerce. And when news departments had to make money when they were bought by corporations, we began to lose news minutes and had more Kim than we could bear. The thing that I find the most disturbing about this is, as a sort of the last generation of a correspondent that's going to have a job with maybe 2 institutions or 3 and healthcare and the kind of money that meant that I could actually have a job, maybe even raise a kid if I'd had one. Now what you see are freelance young journalists coming into the field. They're hardly ever Americans. The Japanese show up, the Koreans show up, the Brits show up, the Italians show up, but there's not young Americans out there because their outlets don't exist for them, so they can't survive it. And I find that that is a big problem. There's more media out there than ever before. There's a huge range of sources. It's fire hose time when I'm looking for information about any story that I'm covering. But it requires a certain media literacy, and it requires you to go and look. It's not going to roll up to your front door anymore. Yeah. It's just not. And let me leave you with one more thing. A friend of mine gave a speech about how younger people feel about the news, and she said that in a study, most college students say, if it's important enough, the news will find me. Which means that my friends on Facebook will tell me, or my Twitter feed will tell me. And I think that that is a disastrous way for Americans to begin to think about the news.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Angelina Esteves, College of the Atlantic.
Especially after 9/11, the fear of Muslims has heightened in the United States. So how would the revolution in the Middle East change the U.S. perspective of Islamic culture, and what role would the social media play in creating this change?
Thank you very much. I think Deborah and Colonel Wilkerson maybe have something to say about this issue.
Go ahead.
Well, you know, I think part of what's happened to us over the last 10 years is if you look at defense budgets and even State Department budgets, we have focused most of our money on fighting in the war on terrorism rather than supporting civil society. I would argue that we got a whole lot more for our money on the civil society side, considering how things are moving in the Middle East, than we did percentage-wise for the war on terror. I think we do have to recognize what has happened and what has been demonstrated publicly about ideology in the Middle East, that the revolutions were a rejection of the worldview of al-Qaeda. It doesn't mean that they disappeared. We are beginning to see them move back into Syria. And that's going to be a problem that will have to be addressed.
Larry.
This is a huge problem in my perspective, from everything at the granular level, like the fact that we did away with the United States Information Agency and pulled public diplomacy into each bureau and department and agency of the State Department, where it is now a stepchild at best. USIA was autonomous, or at least semi-autonomous, and it could deliver the American message without pollution and with power and energy. Jesse Helms was almost single-handedly responsible for getting rid of USIA.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was done away with in 1999, just kind of at the same time that the information age was really launching.
Yeah.
Stroke of brilliance.
Just a stroke of brilliance. But from a broader, more comprehensive perspective, having gone through the efforts in the State Department during what I think was a very critical period to try and speak to the 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, and particularly at the same time to speak to American Muslims, it was very difficult. But I think what happened, and maybe you'd want to re-comment, what happened was that the way we truly believe as Americans got through anyway. And so you have a whole group of Muslims, certainly the dominant amount of Muslims, who recognize, at least from a perspective of democracy and liberty and freedom and economic prosperity and so forth and so on, that there's something to what we're saying. I mean, everything Deborah talked about was pretty much to that tune. At the same time, I think I have it in my briefcase, a list of the people who are donating millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in this country to the other side of the message. Islamofascist, who are putting money into a campaign, a neoconservative orchestrated campaign in some respects by people like Frank Gaffney, for example, who are trying to say that these al-Qaeda and Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jamaat Islamiyah and Abu Sayyaf and you name the group are essentially the equivalent of Adolf Hitler and his Nazis, and that we have to be on the qui vive all the time and we have to be aimed at defeating them. And I think this is a very self-destructive message. It's antithetical to the message that we were trying to send out.
Deborah has a final comment on this.
I want to say that here's one example. YouTube is the soft power of America. And how we know that is the one art form that is sweeping the Middle East is stand-up comedy. And I have no studies that prove this, but my guess is that if you were willing to be a stand-up comedian, you probably won't join al-Qaeda. And how... And how that happened was watching YouTube. That's where it comes from. And in fact, there is a famous comedian, you're going to have to help me with this because it's not my area of expertise, but a guy named Jeff who does his act with a puppet. Jeff Dunham. desperately Saudi Arabian kids wanted him to come. This is a guy who has a puppet who says, I will kill you, because the puppet is a terrorist. And Jeff Dunham was afraid to go because he thought it was a one-way ticket, but they really wanted him to come to Riyadh and be in their stand-up comedy routine. So I'm saying that by accident. Now, what's sad is it's not coming the other way. If there was, 2 nights a week, Arab stand-up comedians on Fox television, I think that would undercut Mr. Gaffney's campaign.
I agree. And I would add to that I think against this current that I just described to you, led by people like Frank Gaffney, Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart have been a wonderful antidote.
They have. Okay, we've got a question, I think, from, do we? A remote location, Jim? Yes, from Rockland, Eric Charlton. Is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to drag us into a war with Iran? I'm going to take a stab at that. I spent the years 2005, 2008 as the U.S. negotiator on Iran for President Bush. I think there's been a single integrated strategy between President Bush and President Obama. There's been very little difference between them. It's been bipartisan. And the strategy is this. Neither President Bush in his second term nor President Obama want to go to war with Iran. They're desperately, President Obama, trying to avoid it. What he's done is he's offered negotiations to Iran through the Perm 5, Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Perm 6. And Iran has consistently turned down negotiations over the last 6 years since June 2006. Because of that, we've been sanctioning Iran. And right now, the United States is on the verge of the toughest sanctions ever, sanctions against the Iranian Central Bank. And the EU oil sanctions. They're going to take themselves off the oil spigot from Iran. I think Obama's strategy is let that sanctions play out, delay the use of force for as long as it's possible. He may have to decide in this term if he's reelected or if someone else comes in a future term to use force, but delay it for as long as possible. The wild card is this question. Will Prime Minister Netanyahu, and let's face it, the Israeli Prime Minister has to be concerned about a country like Iran developing a nuclear weapons capacity perhaps in the future. Ahmadinejad has pledged several times to wipe Israel off the map of the world. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei said 2 weeks ago in a Friday sermon, Israel is a scourge and has to be eradicated. Given Jewish history and given the ethic of the Israeli state, the Prime Minister has to be concerned about this and tough-minded. I hope, however, that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu have an agreement that's private, that would go something like this. President Obama, I've got your back. I've got Israel's security interests in mind. We will protect Israel, but please don't attack. Because if Israel attacks, this is President Obama to Prime Minister Netanyahu, Iran's going to respond, probably asymmetrically, probably through Hezbollah or Hamas. That, by definition, will drag the United States into a limited war or a more protracted war in the Middle East. And President Obama, he wants to fight on his terms at a time of his choosing, and now's not that time. That's the Obama strategy. I find that eminently wise, reasonable, and in the American interest. I hope the Israelis don't go ahead of us. Now, the last factor I'd say is that the press is beginning to report over the last couple of days that negotiations are imminent. And the United States has this offer out there. The Iranians said on Friday that they are prone to accept the offer to negotiate. And Secretary Clinton met with Catherine Ashton, the EU foreign policy chief, on Friday at the State Department, and they spoke publicly about negotiations. Let's hope the negotiations begin for 2 reasons. One, it'll make it extremely difficult for Netanyahu to use force while negotiations are taking place. 2, we've not had, as I said yesterday, a sustained, serious discussion with the Iranians since the Jimmy Carter administration in 1979-80. It is insane to think that we go to war against a country with which we don't speak, and of which we have no real knowledge about whether or not there's a deal that can be made, short of war, a compromise perhaps, hopefully one favorable to us, that would allow Iran not to achieve a nuclear weapons capability, but would keep us out of a war. Diplomacy is really important here. It's what the State Department does. It's a critical asset for our nation. We have a great Secretary of State in Hillary Clinton, and I hope that she has a chance to negotiate with the Iranians. Colonel.
And I just want to echo what Ambassador Burns says. I'm not going to say that, but just the military analogy would be, when you got to go take a building, you don't take it from the ground floor up, because the bad guys have no place to run, and they're going to fight to the end. So you try to take the building from the top down, so they have a place to run to. They run out the building. We've got to make sure that we give the Iranians a place to run to, and that's not being soft with them or anything, but it goes right to the point of diplomacy. If all we're going to do is frame a hard circle around them, we went to a binary choice, and they're going to pick the one that we don't like. So I just want to echo you.
That's a really important point, that in a negotiation, if you completely wall off the adversary across from you and don't provide exit doors, you're more likely to produce a conflict. So what the Colonel's recommending is, negotiations are an exit door for the Iranians. And if they take it this week or next, and you see Secretary Clinton on the evening news announcing negotiations, that's a great thing.
Let me just touch one other point. Last week, we met with George Perkovich, Ambassador Tom Pickering, Ambassador Bill Lewis, and a number of others, technical experts as well as diplomats. And Jim Dobbins, actually, another ambassador, made the most salient point in my mind. And it was, he said, you don't know what you want until you start talking. Yeah. You don't. You think you do, maybe, but you don't. Because you don't know what you want until you know what you can get. And so you've got to start talking. You've got to start negotiating. You've got to start listening to, and your enemy's got to start listening to you. And I think that's a real solid point. And my big concern here is that I hope it's going on in secret, or will go on in secret. I think it should be secret, given my party's attitude. My party's attitude is get the president out of the White House. I mean, I'll be very candid with you. I've heard that from so many Republicans that it's nauseous. So if that's their attitude and they're going to jump on everything that you do, it has to happen in secret, I think. And then you have to foist it on them, much the way Nixon did the opening to China on the right wing in our party. So that's my concern, is that those kind of talks aren't going on. I hope they are.
Yes, right here.
Jim Carney, Salem, Mass. Amory talked about the value of preventing war as being so much more better than fighting it. Does anybody see a way to have done that with Afghanistan?
Captain Porter, or Colonel Wilkerson, you were there, I think, in the State Department in autumn of 2001.
To the credit of the administration, I think, how serious they were about it, I don't know. I know my boss was serious about it, Colin Powell. We gave what we had in international law and diplomatic terms recognized as the government of Afghanistan. We gave them an opportunity to turn over al-Qaeda. We made a very forceful offer. Turn over al-Qaeda and, hell won't rain on you. They refused, and a lot of that was cultural, I think. This notion of, I don't care how bad this person is, he's my guest. And Mullah Omar and others simply wouldn't answer that diplomatic gesture positively, and then it turned into war. I think one of the mistakes we made, now I'm putting my military hat on now. If you look, and I'm going to give a talk to the League of Women Voters in Williamsburg as soon as I get back Tuesday morning about this. I'm going to put a map of Afghanistan up as my first move, and I'm going to talk as a military man. I'm going to say, would you go there? Look, would you go there? You cannot resupply. You need Uzbekistan, you need Iran, you need Pakistan, you need somebody in order to even resupply. Just the move, when Pakistan got irritated and closed everything down, just the move to the other logistics operational channel, the lock, just that move cost us about an extra $1 billion a day. You would never go there if you were a military person because you can't depend on your logistics. Move into some of the other things that we did afterwards. I'm speaking as a military man now. I would never have done them. I would have kicked Al-Qaeda's butt. I would have got out of Afghanistan, and I would have said back to Afghanistan, you let it happen again, I'll come back and kick your butt again. We don't control Kabul. We don't control Afghanistan, except as we have a soldier or Marine standing on a piece of ground. And the joke in Kabul is Karzai controls less and less of Kabul.
5 days after 9/11, President Bush convened his war cabinet at Laurel Lodge in Camp David, and Condi Rice tells the story when they put the map out on the table. It speaks to Colonel Wilkerson's point, and they reflected on the geography of Afghanistan and of South Asia. She said her heart sank because as an historian, she knew that was the graveyard of empires, of Britain and of the Soviet Union. We were attacked, but we never thought we'd occupy that country for 10 years with no end in sight. That's the tragedy of Afghanistan. Yes.
Mr. Moderator, I'll leave it to you in response to my question to choose your panel from the 5 you have. My question, I'm Spencer Hurt from Tennant's Harbor, and I'd like to know if there is a role for religion and what that might be, and how is it going to move along when we consider the many religions, the many languages that they all represent. I'm talking worldwide. Thank you.
Sir, if I could just ask you to expand and illuminate your question, is there a role for religion in a positive sense, in breaking down barriers?
I hope it's a positive sense.
Yeah. And you're talking about globally.
I'm sorry?
You're speaking globally, not about the United States.
Right.
Okay.
Globally.
I'll be happy to take it.
Captain. Yeah.
So I can't address the military. I can talk about religion, I guess.
They're never related, right?
I'm actually going to go back to a previous question when I answer this question. Much of what we talk about in the narrative is the fact that we have common values, and that is what provides us credibility. Every religion that I know of has values that are not distinct necessarily to that particular religion. And in fact, in seeking the converging interests of values among religions, we can become far more inclusive than we are now. And I think that's a far better approach to the future than exclusion, and we're seeing that demonstrated all over the world. I wanted to go back to the previous question about Islamism and the place of Muslims in the United States. We're great because we are a diverse nation, and we include a variety of religions and a number of people who aren't religious in any way whatsoever. The interesting thing is that there have been far more Muslims killed by violent Islamist extremist acts than non-Muslims. I mean, orders of magnitude, something like well beyond 90% of the victims have been Muslim. Any religion isn't going to get far by killing its own constituency. So my sense is that we have so many contributing and patriotic Muslims in America. We do need to hear from them because they are part of the fabric of this country. We support them, and they need to let other Muslims know what their life is like here, that it is positive. And we can't address the ideology or the hateful perversion of any religion. That's really up to the individual practitioners and the adherents to those particular religions themselves to do. But we can address the conditionality that feeds into the disenfranchisement and the frustration. We can address joblessness, and we can address women's rights, and we can address a number of problems that cause frustration to exhibit themselves in the extreme forms of any belief system. And I think if we can do that in a way that empowers the nations of any religion, that empowers democratic Muslim nations or democratic any nation in the world, willing to respect common values, then I think that's a way to use religion as a unifying and a very positive force, and I think we desperately need that in this country. As a matter of fact, I'm speaking at Gonzaga University in a couple of months, and I know this is going to be one of the topics that I'm going to be asked.
It's a really good question, sir. And if you think about the Hindu-Muslim clashes in Gujarat, the Indian state of Gujarat, at the beginning of the last decade, think about the Muslim-Christian clashes that we've seen in Nigeria. Just in the last couple of months, religion's been a divisive force in many ways, but there's a little bit of hope. There are people like Rabbi Arthur Schneier. He's a rabbi in a synagogue in the east side of New York, who promotes ecumenical dialogue among Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus. He's done a wonderful job all over the world with the Appeal of Conscience Foundation. I'm on his board. And so there are lots of Americans trying to promote dialogue across religious lines, and we certainly do need that in our own country as well as internationally.
Hi, I'm Nick Sander. I'm from New York, and I am in the private sector. And I want to address this. It's been said that the Chinese government is really just a giant chamber of commerce. And although that may be, somewhat apocryphal, it really shows their success in that they promote business within their country a huge amount. How can we nudge our federal government to just have a tiny amount of that in their ethos, if you will?
The federal government made a big change under George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, in instructing the rest of the government that commercial diplomacy should be a priority. That if you have an ambassador in South Africa or Japan, a big part of that ambassador's job should be helping American firms get into the market, win contracts, and create a level playing field. And I think President Bush started that way back in 1989-90, and most presidents have subscribed to that. But we still don't, in my judgment, play that game as effectively as the French do, as the Germans do, as the Chinese do. If you look at most of the major defense contracts, for instance, that are up these days, Sarkozy will fly into a foreign capital just on that order of business alone. And our presidents, from President Obama, President Bush 43, President Clinton, haven't gone that far. And the playing field is not level because you have state intervention on the part of most countries. You really don't have it to that extent by the United States. So I think our government could do more to help the private sector to succeed. And the problem with China, there's a lot to admire and there's a lot to criticize. China is a major violator of the intellectual property of probably your industry and most other industries. They don't play by the rules. They cheat. There are a lot of suspicions that the Chinese government is involved in cyber espionage against international firms. Certainly Chinese hackers are, and they're not prosecuted by the government of China. That's true of Ukraine and Russia as well. So one of the things we've got to do is stand up for the private sector by calling these countries on their malfeasance when their governments don't do the right thing, and sometimes when they're active violators of international business and commerce law. But Governor DuPont, you may have a view on this.
Well, yes. I don't think, I kind of agree with your perspective. The amount of government regulation of what's going on in the American economy is growing every week. And you look at what's been passed in Washington, and the various departments are in charge of all kinds of things. We ought to get away from that. We ought to let you decide in your business what you'd like to do to make it better. You can't violate the law, but you can certainly decide whether to invest here or over here. And I don't think it's going well yet. So I hope you keep saying that, because maybe it would have a little impact.
I think we have a question from a remote location, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps a written question. From Belfast, Maggie Samuels, what role does Turkey have in enabling or assisting the youth of the Middle East in continuing the Arab awakening? Will Turkey have an increased role in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, Deborah?
Yes. Turkey has been the model, and if you want to see how it works in what I was talking about in what's happening in Egypt, Turkey has shown the way that the Islamists are the clean guys. Erdogan was a very good mayor in Istanbul when he ran Istanbul, and so it was a demonstration project. What Turkey has shown the region is that you can be Islamic and democratic and not lose your culture, which is what the Iranians have argued for a long time. And Turkey's shown that not only can you do those things, you can have 20% growth and not have any oil, which is an amazing example for the region. And I have a professor at Stanford who said that this really is the culmination of a debate that's going on for 150 years inside Islam. And for the first time, the dominant Islam is the one that's learned as much from John Locke as John Lennon. And that's what we've seen demonstrated on Tahrir Square. I think he's right about that, and I think that Turkey is an example of that. I don't think they should do everything in the Middle East, and we'll have a little trouble with that with Syria, because they do have their own interests, which are different than ours. They are closer, for one thing, and they want to be the dominant Sunni power. But I think, get ready, they're going to play a rather big role with us.
We have less than 10 minutes left, and we have at least 3 people who want to ask questions. We'll try to fit them all in, if not even more. Yes, right here.
To go back to a comment a few moments ago, I don't think that Fox News has 24 hours of their airtime they can spare for stand-up comedy. I do have a question, though. When we went to 24-hour-a-day news, I thought that was a great thing. I thought that we'd be graced with 24 hours a day of Howard K. Smith and things like that. But instead, we have, on both sides of the political spectrum, 24-hour-a-day news is very divisive, and I think it's become a severe problem. Can journalism do anything to clean that up?
Deborah, since you're the only journalist among us,
Guilty
once again,
as charged.
into the fray.
It's the market. And so there's not much. I'll tell you what I do about it. On my iPad, I have France 24 in English. I watch the BBC. I watch Al Jazeera. I listen to NPR in the morning, but I'll check in on the CBC. I just have a different menu for my news. And I can just avoid all of that and have a fine time, because there's plenty out there. So I just urge you, since this is a market-driven economy in the news business, starve them of capital. Turn off your television, and that will change.
Are you saying turn off the TV and listen to NPR?
No. You can have all those same apps.
I was just kidding. Yes.
My name is Katie DiTullio, and I'm a student at College of the Atlantic. My question is about the national strategic narrative. Yesterday it was mentioned that U.S. schools should be encouraging things like divergent thinking and interdisciplinary learning. And so I'm wondering how we should go about doing this when we are competing economically with countries like China and Japan that have very rigid educational systems that do not encourage those things and that base achievement and often determine students' futures solely based on the results of a single standardized test.
Good question.
Let me just remark on an experiment that we started about 5 years ago at the George Washington University in the honors program, which I think has just caught fire. And it's just one anecdote, one example, but we went over to the Hill, to the Congress, and to others in the power structure and said, what are your problems? What are your problems in the real world? Let our students deal with them. And in order to put that together, we had to bring physicists, chemists, oceanographers, political scientists, public policy. We had to bring every discipline at George Washington in and put them together in front of these students as these students in seminar with these mentors tried to tackle real-world problems, produce a paper, and take it over to the Senate or take it to the White House or whatever. That's real interdisciplinary education in my view. It's both practical and it's pedagogical, and it works.
Puck, I think you...
Yeah, I think in asking your question, you gave yourself the answer because, quite frankly, I don't care what anybody else is doing. This goes back to my pal Epictetus. I control what I can control. What I can, and so, in my mind, having this broad, the way we educate, yes, we can improve. You need to put more competition and more entrepreneurialism in how we educate, and have a menu of options on how to go, because in that course of that competition, I think we'll get better. If all we do is just focus on the test score, I don't care how the Chinese do it, because what the Chinese don't have culturally through their education system is really an innate capacity to innovate. Now, they have expressly stated that that's something they want to develop in a long-term strategy, which is a pretty interesting comment. But right now, they don't have it. In an education system of rote memorization, or just focusing on just one venue, one lane, one niche, is not going to get them there. I think if we go to a more interdisciplinary, a more Renaissance approach, it gives you the capacity for critical thinking, for novelty, for innovation, for asking questions, and just being perennially curious. I mean, that is an American attribute, and I think it's going to not only be our strength, I think it's going to be our salvation. So I don't know if that's the answer that you were looking for, but I'm not worried about what anybody else is. I just think that's the right thing to do, and we should go back to what we do well, and that is just to be productive contrarians, and that we just go, I don't care what the status quo is. I want to make it better. I want to make it different, because that's the way forward for me to be successful. So,
thank you very much. Yes.
I'm still Davies Allen from Westport Island, and this is going to be kind of tricky, and it's for Larry, and it has to do with your boss, Colin Powell, and when he was duped into thinking that tanker trucks were actually weapons of mass destruction. And I'm going to go through a brief litany of how I feel about the influences of the Jewish lobby.
Sir, can I just ask? We've got 3 minutes and 48 seconds.
All right.
3 minutes and 48 seconds. Just ask the question, because there's another person in the balcony, a student, who wants to ask a follow-up.
I'll be quick.
Thank you.
What is it that goes on in the United States where a minority is allowed to drive policy for the country, and how does that happen, and how can we counterbalance that in some fashion?
Well, it's been happening since roughly 1776.
That's exactly right.
In our colonial period, I could go back further. I think the tyranny of the minority is just as bad as the tyranny of the majority. And the only way you can fight it is by educating the majority, or at least a substantial other minority, and combating it. That's the only way you can do it. That's what I'm trying to do in Cuba right now. Our Cuba policy is utter lunacy. We're the only people in the world, not in Cuba, doing things to help 11.5 million Cuban people, not Raul and Fidel. Everyone's there. The Israelis are there running their citrus industry. So it's lunacy, and it's lunacy because of a very small group of hardline, very well-moneyed Cuban Americans. We just have to keep fighting them, and sanity will eventually win.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Eliza Rule. I'm from College of the Atlantic. And going off one of the earlier questions today, in her book, One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy, Professor Alison Stanger describes a future in which government outsourcing cedes increasing authority to private companies, and says international influence of for-benefit corporations, or what she calls the fourth sector, will rise. Considering this, in the future, what role would the American government play in international diplomatic and peacemaking strategies? And how can a more ecological education, which Captain Porter and Colonel Meckelby describe as being key to a strategic ecology, assist in preparing young citizens to serve their country by filling that governmental role?
It's a very good question, well articulated. Thank you. We've got about a minute. Maybe I could ask Captain Porter and Colonel Mickleby.
Let me just say one thing.
A minute between you.
That's a superb book. I recommend it to everyone.
Thank you. Captain Porter.
One of the things that I think we've seen evolve, particularly in the information age, I'm going to talk quick because we addressed this yesterday, is the fact that individuals, movements, international, multinational corporations often now have as much power as sovereign nations. So we're in an environment in which we need to recognize that ethics matter and that ethics is a sustainable way forward, just as values are for a country and for a strategy. The truth of this, again, is through inclusion and exclusion. So I think the path is to try to include a convergence of interest among fairly competing and ethical-based entities, whether they be multinationals, individuals, or states, and to pursue common values forward for a non-zero-sum gain, which means you can have multiple winners, not a single winner and multiple losers.
Puck?
Yeah, I mean, how do you pursue the opportunity space? I mean, I guess I'll just try to address the second half of your question about an ecologically based education. I mean, it's based in science, it's based in also a moral recognition of interconnection in a strategic ecology. Start thinking in those terms is less of us and them versus them, and it goes to what Wayne just said about where do we have converging interests. That goes back to the issue when we talked earlier about competition and how we frame out competition. If everything is a threat, well, then we're going to continue to do what we do. But just remember, the Cicero kind of came up with this one. And he said, arms in the field are of little effect if there's no wisdom at home to guide it. The reason why we talk about ecology and how we are connected to a strategic ecology is we need to have an innate wisdom in how we approach our role in that world. And so is that philosophical? Yes, but it's also a philosophy wedded to a science and a reality and systems thinking, et cetera. We've got to get to that place because no matter how hard we try, we can't impose what we want on the world, our own worldview. It doesn't fit in the box. The world's got its own logic, and it's not going to subscribe to the rule sets we become comfortable with. That's why we've got to look ourselves in the mirror, maybe take on some hard assumptions that we think are facts and are not indeed facts, and accept that with a little bit of intellectual and emotional honesty so that we can craft a wise approach to our role in the world. And maybe I still believe we'll lead, but we'll lead from a position of partnership and not from a position of paternalism. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you all forgive me for taking the prerogative of this microphone for 1 minute. I am troubled by one of the questions, and the person had an absolute right to ask it. But I wouldn't want to let the feeling stand that at this conference we were going to single out one group for criticism. Jewish Americans have the right to organize on behalf of a cause, the State of Israel, that they believe in. Armenian Americans, Irish Americans, I'm Irish, have a right to organize for Ireland. And Italians, and nuclear zero enthusiasts, and climate enthusiasts, and Tea Party, we all have a right to organize. It's the essence of our democracy. And I wouldn't want one of the final notes of this conference to be singling out one group of Americans when we all have the obligation as citizens to stand up and support whatever interests are important to us. Those groups aren't the problem. The problem or the responsibility lies with the politicians, political leaders, just to make good decisions on behalf of our country. I just didn't want to end the conference on that note. So thank you for listening to that. And I want to thank this panel and for great contributions. Thank you very much.
Good job.